Okay, thank you all for coming tonight. Our Adult Ed Committee has been working on bringing some terrific programming, and we have actually been contacted and in touch with a number of different authors and lecturers. And Cary Lowe actually happens to be local to San Diego, which was a treat and very exciting. And we wanted to invite him to come and learn with our congregation and show us and teach us. And we've got a number of questions lined up about the book. I know we only have an hour together, so we did want to get started, but I wanted to thank the Adult Ed Committee for bringing us tonight's program. And I'm actually going to advance. Can everyone see those slides? Did that work? Perfect. So I wanted to put those out there because in addition, one of the things we're going to do tonight is we're going to hear a little bit of background about the book, and then we're going to dive into some questions. So for the meantime, I'm going to remove my spotlight, and you'll all be able to hear from our author, and then we will re-engage that when we hop into the questions. Thank you all so much. Take it away, Cary.
Okay. Well, thank you all for coming. I'm happy to be here to talk to you about my book. This book started out as just a series of stories from my family. It came out of a trip I took with my daughter quite a few years ago, kind of a roots trip back to where our family was from in Eastern Europe. And coming back from that, I decided to write about it for the rest of our family. That led to writing more stories about my experiences growing up in Europe in the years after World War II and after the Holocaust. Eventually, after I'd written quite a few separate stories, I started to get interested in turning it into a book. And what I think finally prompted me to do that was the politics of the country as it became more and more controversial about immigration and who were real Americans, what people should be admitted to the country, and so on. I started to feel like there was a need to demonstrate that immigrants could be really significant contributors to American culture and society and politics, and decided to use this book for that purpose. So that's a quick background on it.
So I know that a few people actually did read the book, and that's amazing because that's usually where we get our best Q&A from. So our first question is, what motivated you to write the book?
Yeah, and that's really what I was just describing. If you look at the two pictures that are shown on the screen right now, the one on the left is I'm standing before the gates of a Jewish cemetery in a town called Strakonec, which is outside Prague in what's now the Czech Republic. And that's where my paternal great-grandparents are buried. And my daughter and I found that cemetery after an incredible adventure that described in the book that's literally like something out of an Indiana Jones movie. But we did find it, and that was a major point in launching me into writing about all this. The picture on the right, I'm standing in the old Jewish cemetery in Prague, and the structure next to me is the tomb of Rabbi Judah Lowe, who is an ancestor of mine on my father's side. And some of you may know him or know of him as the rabbi who in Jewish mythology, I'll say, created the golem, the creature known as the golem. He was a mystic and pretty famous in his time. People come to his gravesite there, the tour groups stop there. So it's an interesting little tidbit of family history. So my family was quite heavily impacted by the Holocaust. My mother lost most of her immediate family. Just she and one sister survived by going into hiding. And I'll talk about that a little more in a minute. So my maternal grandparents and my aunt, one of my mother's sisters, were killed. My father lost a lot of relatives as well, although he and his immediate family were able to escape. The Holocaust, of course, changed their lives completely. They became refugees on my father's side, and on my mother's side, they mostly were murdered. So it was had a pretty big impact on us. So I mentioned that my mother survived in hiding and my father survived by being able to flee. My mother's story is it's quite an adventure. She was hidden by a family, a Baptist family in another town in Slovakia, and was able to stay kind of hidden in plain sight, if you will, by pretending to be a member of this family. But then having to flee when people started to become suspicious about her and German soldiers started coming around. She and her sister, who was the one sister who survived, who was in hiding in another town, reunited, and together in the dead of winter somehow made it through the mountains to another town where there was an uprising going on against the Nazis. And so they joined the resistance there, and that's where they stayed through the rest of the war. My father's escape is in some ways even more dramatic. Not long after Kristallnacht, he was living with his family in Vienna, and they decided it was then time to get out, although it was getting pretty late. His parents and sister managed to get out separately, and I don't know why he had to stay behind and travel separately. But in any event, he was on a train traveling first across Austria and then across part of Germany to reach a ship that would take him to New York. And when he got to the German border, border guards, seeing his passport and noting that he was Jewish, were going to take him off the train and detain him. And a fellow that he was engaged in a chess game with on the train interceded and turned out to be a high-ranking Nazi official who essentially ordered the guards to leave my father alone because they had a chess game to finish. Now, that's about as bizarre a story as you can imagine about someone escaping. And this Nazi official just didn't do anything more about it. He was more concerned with finishing his chess game than what happened to one more Jewish refugee. So pretty amazing. Growing up where I did in, I guess what you call the heart of the Third Reich, was pretty strange in a lot of ways. Hard to believe for a child, to come to terms with what had happened there, even though the damage from the war was all around us. Bombed buildings. We played in the remnants of German army bunkers from the war. I met concentration camp survivors. Of course, I knew my parents' experiences. There was a displaced persons camp right across from where we lived in one town in Germany. So it was all around us, and yet the thing that was so peculiar was that, as a child anyway, I never saw or heard any instances of anti-Semitism. I mean, these people had just finished killing 6 million of our brethren, and yet they acted as if we were just part of that community. Very peculiar, very hard to come to terms with. And yet, in my hometown of Braunau in Austria, Braunau was also the birthplace of Adolf Hitler. There was a house there that you see in the picture there on the screen, commonly referred to as the Hitler House. And it was a source of great controversy, as you can imagine, what to do with that after the war. And it was right there in the middle of town, just a couple blocks off the town square. We walked past it all the time. And I can remember my mother and other people kind of shunning it and not wanting to walk on the same side of the street with it. And when I asked my mother about it, she would just say, you know, a very evil man lived there, someone who killed members of our family and many other people. And that's all she would say about it. She wouldn't talk about her experiences for a long time. But the other thing that brought it home to me was that my father, after the war, he worked on the prosecution staff at the Nuremberg war crimes trials as a translator and investigator, and then later worked for U.S. Army counterintelligence during the rest of the post-war occupation of Austria. And I can remember these gatherings at our home where his counterintelligence colleagues would be there for dinner and sit around afterwards talking about the people they were detaining and interrogating, looking for information, especially about what was going on in Eastern Europe behind the Iron Curtain. And hearing them talk about interviewing or interrogating former Nazi officials, all sorts of people. I mean, it so brought the war home to me, you know, and yet, as I say, the enormity of it was almost impossible for a child of that age to completely comprehend. Now, I mentioned earlier that I didn't actually have any direct experiences with anti-Semitism as a child, which seems very peculiar looking back on it. But I certainly knew about it. I mean, I knew what had happened to our family. I knew enough about the Holocaust to know what anti-Semitism was, even though I hadn't directly experienced it. Here's the interesting thing. When I was 7 or 8 years old, my family took a trip from Germany, where we were then living. My father, meanwhile, had transferred to another intelligence agency with the Air Force in Germany. And we took a trip to the United States for the first time. And that involved going first to New York and then to Louisiana, because we had relatives in both of those places. When we went to the South, my father started talking to me about how difficult it was for our family and other Jews living in the South then, although certainly not as bad as it was for Black people living there. But, you know, he certainly made me aware of how anti-Semitism was active in the United States. And of course, I saw Jim Crow conditions for Black people there. I mean, I remember being stunned at seeing water fountains and restrooms and things, you know, labeled colored and white, and just seeing evidence of that everywhere we went. Maybe that opened my eyes to things when we got back to Europe, because I started to notice more bigotry among adults especially, because the military in those days was very heavily made up of people from the South and the Midwest, a lot of people from small towns or rural areas whose experience with racial minorities was pretty limited, or to the extent that it happened at all, it was not very good. So I heard a lot of pretty bigoted comments, and then started noticing that among my classmates as well, because of course they were learning it from their parents. But I also noticed it among the Germans. I spoke enough German, even though now I had changed over to speaking English as my primary language. German had been my first language as a young child, and so often I would hear Germans speaking about Americans, not knowing that I could understand them, and saying pretty awful racist things as well. Interestingly, mostly about Black GIs that they saw there. And again, I just don't recall ever hearing them say anything about Jews, although that may have just been because they were self-censoring and knew that was just so forbidden a topic. Interesting question is when I started to actually feel like an American. And when you read the book, you'll see it really happened in stages. My becoming Americanized began, I would say, when we moved from the small town of Braunau, where we were, there were just a handful of Americans there, and they were all people like our family who had been immigrants or refugees that now worked for the American government. We moved to Linz, a larger city where there was a U.S. Army base, and so a lot of Americans there, and we lived in an American housing area. I started going to school there, and again, English became my primary language. So that was how it began. Then in my teens, we moved to the United States, to the Boston area. So then I went to high school there, got completely immersed in American culture, music, everything. And of course, then went on to moving to California, went to college here, went into the Navy. I'd been in Naval ROTC in college, so I was commissioned as an officer in the Navy. Each of these things made me feel like I'd taken another step toward being a full American. Later on, going to law school, becoming an attorney, and becoming a public official. All these things, as I say, step by step, contributed to my eventually feeling fully like an American. The interesting other aspect of that is becoming politically aware, not just feeling Americanized, but becoming politically engaged. And interestingly, that began while I was still in Germany. One of my teachers there in junior high school in 1960 had gotten us to participate in the US presidential campaign by having us write to the respective candidates and get information about the campaigns. I actually got a personal letter back from John Kennedy with a bunch of campaign literature and bumper stickers and things. I don't think he knew that I was just a young kid at a military base. He probably thought I was an adult, but regardless, I wound up leading half of my class in its participation on the Democratic side in that campaign. And so when we moved to the United States, my mother started working on political campaigns in the Boston area. And so I just became more politically engaged. One of my father's colleagues later became a speechwriter for Bobby Kennedy and was living in Los Angeles. Got me involved in that campaign in a small way. And from there, it just kind of mushroomed. I started working on more political campaigns, was very active in George McGovern's presidential campaign in 1972, and then continued working on lots of local and state level campaigns to where I felt like I was really politically engaged by the time I was in my 20s. Out of all of that, I felt like I made some pretty important contributions to American politics and society. I worked for a number of years after law school as a public interest lawyer, representing a number of different organizations in the Los Angeles area. We worked on campaigns involving housing rights, healthcare, reform of government institutions, all kinds of things that I felt like really had a positive impact on my community and on the political scene in Los Angeles and in California. Later on, I started working more at the state level and did a lot of lobbying on housing issues and other things in Sacramento. Got appointed to a number of commissions. You can see in the photo on the screen now, there I am with then Governor Jerry Brown at a news conference where we were announcing a new housing program. And just that continued for quite a few years, both at the local level in Los Angeles as well as at the state level. In the mid-'80s, I started to practice more conventional law and focused on law relating to housing development and land use issues, and had some great years in that profession. I look back on it now, 40 plus years doing that kind of legal work, representing landowners, home builders, land developers, and public agencies. And then eventually other kinds of groups like Indian tribes and others who were interested in land use and environmental issues. By the time I retired a couple of years ago, I went back and did a rough calculation trying to figure out how much of an impact I had and estimated that I had, in one way or another, helped to build something like 25,000 homes, as well as innumerable schools, shopping centers, offices, and so on. In other words, the equivalent of a small city. A city bigger than my hometown back in Austria, bigger than the town that I lived in Massachusetts next. So I felt pretty good about that. Felt like I had made some pretty substantial contributions to my adopted country. People ask, after all these years, do I feel fully Americanized, or do I still identify at all as an immigrant? And I think anybody who was an immigrant, and that may include some of you, you always have one foot back in the old country, back in the place you came from, because that's where the most formative early experiences of your life occurred. So I don't feel like I will ever completely be separated from that, and I wouldn't want to. I think that connection is an important part of what makes me someone who enriches American culture by bringing that background, that culture over here and infusing it into American society. So I think that'll always be there. And frankly, the fact that that is how it is really demonstrates how much immigrants enrich this country and make a contribution to everything here, from its economy, society, politics, arts, everything. And when I look back on everything I wrote about in the book, of course, I always think of other things I wish I had written about, anecdotes that I might have included, or sometimes just small details. But there are a couple of more significant things that I wish I had included that I probably would add if I ever did a revised or updated version of the book. Years later, I went back to some of the same places. My first wife had died in the meantime. She had been ill at the time of my first trip over there with my daughter and hadn't been able to go with us, and she died shortly after that. But after I remarried some years later, my current wife and I took a trip back to many of the same places, to Prague, to the town near there where my father had been born, and then the cemetery where my great-grandparents were buried. And what was amazing about that was that without a map, without directions like the ones that I had finally gotten to find that place in the first instance, it was like I just homed in on it. I found my way there as if by instinct. And that was an amazing experience, coming back to that cemetery, this time not being able to get into it. The previous time I got into it by literally climbing over the cemetery walls with the help of a couple of construction workers who were nearby and lent me a ladder. And that enabled me to actually find my great-grandparents' graves, which are pictured in the book. And the whole story of finding that cemetery is quite a drama that I describe in detail at the beginning of the book. But I wish I had written about that return trip. The other thing I didn't include, because I was very conflicted about it at the time, and now wish I had included it, was that on that second trip, for the first time in my life, I visited the Mauthausen concentration camp, which was really not very far from where I grew up, but my parents never took me and my brother to any of the concentration camps. Mauthausen was very close by. Dachau was not that far away either. And although we traveled all over Europe in those years, they never visited any of those places. They made us aware of them, but we never visited there. So when my wife and I went to Mauthausen, that was a very dramatic experience for me. I don't know for sure, but it's very likely that relatives of my father were murdered there. And seeing the gas chambers, seeing the other facilities there, I mean, it's a pretty well-preserved site. Made a big impression on me. So again, if I ever revise the book, that's a story that I want to include. So with that, I'm happy to talk about anything else that any of the rest of you would like to bring up, anything you'd like to ask me.
Well, I know you had talked a little bit about that, the kind of quest, like you had just mentioned in the beginning of the book about the cemetery. So that's super fascinating. I know that for those of you that read the book, I think Elisa and Robert both did. I'll pick on you both only because you probably have now that you've heard from the author, if there's anything that kind of bubbled up, please feel free. You can unmute and ask away. Or anyone. I shouldn't just pick on them. Oh, Elisa, I think, oh, you muted.
I read the book as soon as I became aware that you were going to give this program. So I read it, I don't know, 4 or 5 months ago. So, but we just revisited it. I think everyone that's here would like to hear about, not only when you came to the United States and got involved in California politics, all the different groups that you became involved in, and some of the names that we would know because they're so prominent might be interesting to everybody else.
Yeah, sure. When I first started doing public interest work after I got out of law school, I first was involved in Los Angeles and got to know a lot of the city council members there, but also Mayor Tom Bradley, who was elected mayor right around that time, as well as the city council president, John Ferraro. Both of them wound up appointing me to commissions at the city of Los Angeles, having to do with housing issues in particular. More at the state level, in the late 70s, I guess 1976, I got involved in Tom Hayden's U.S. Senate campaign. And, I didn't know him. Oh yeah, there's a picture of me and Tom at the LA City Council a couple of years later. But I knew about him, of course, from the Chicago 7 trial. But even before that, while I was in the Navy, I had seen him on television during the demonstrations at the '68 Democratic Convention in Chicago, and was just impressed with how he was being interviewed on national television and talking about the war in Vietnam. And at that time, I was on my way to getting commissioned in the Navy and still had very conflicted views about the war. But nonetheless, I was very impressed with him. Anyway, by the time I actually met him, I had been in the Navy and got out and was working in politics again in California. I was approached by someone that was a colleague of his, a guy named Fred Bramfman, who was pretty famous in the Vietnam anti-war movement. And he wanted me to come and work with him in a what I'll call a think tank that they were proposing to set up. This was after the Senate campaign and before Tom formed a statewide political organization. So I had been working with a particular group in Los Angeles called the Community Information Project, but they were converting into being more of a media-oriented entity than I was interested in working in. And so I took Fred up on his invitation, went to work with him, and we set up something called the California Public Policy Center. that became what I'll call, again, a think tank to serve various political and community organizations by doing research and developing policies that they could advocate for. Hayden, in the meantime, formed a statewide political organization called the Campaign for Economic Democracy. We attended the meetings of that organization and served as a kind of resource for them. And through that, I got involved more and more in state level politics. Got to know Jerry Brown a little bit, many members of the legislature, and just generally became, I guess I'll call it a presence in debates at the state level over a lot of housing policies, financial policies, other things that that our policy center had worked on. So it was a pretty heady time, and something I look back on with great appreciation now for how much we were able to accomplish and how interesting it was. And of course, it played out. Tom got elected to the state legislature. Other people went on to do many other things, from running for office to becoming lawyers or college professors or whatever. But we had a reunion a couple of years ago after Hayden died. There was a big memorial for him at UCLA. And before that, all the people from those times that had worked together got together at someone's home. And it was quite amazing, talking about those times, reminiscing about it, really brought it all back alive again. And we all felt real good about it. So anyway, hopefully that gives you more of a feel for what the experiences were that we had during those years.
Wonderful, thank you. Can you tell us a little bit more about how you got involved with all of your writing and articles and that kind of side of your life? I know that you had mentioned like over 50 articles and things like that for different publications.
Yeah, that interestingly came out of that same period. I was always interested in writing. I was an English lit major in college, and did a lot of amateur writing then. Got one thing published in a student magazine, but it wasn't until I was involved more in politics and specifically working with Hayden and all that group of people that it really launched my more active writing career. I went with Tom to a meeting at the Los Angeles Times to meet with members of their editorial board and talk about some of the issues that we were working on. And at the time, rent control was a big statewide issue. This was right after Prop 13 had passed, and tenants were demanding a share of the benefits that landlords were getting out of that. One of the editorial page editors turned to me and said, well, we want to do something on rent control. You want to write the pro article? We're going to get somebody else to write the anti article. And so I did. And that really launched my relationship with the Times and launched my, what I call it, not my career, but my sub-career as an op-ed writer. And Eileen, as you say, I wound up writing 50-some op-ed essays over the years. First, they were mostly for the LA Times, occasionally for the Sacramento Bee when they involved state legislative issues. Then when I moved to San Diego about 10 years ago, I started writing for the Union Tribune, and that's where most of the articles I've written since have appeared, focusing more on San Diego issues these days, but ones that often have statewide implications as well. So that's been great. I feel like I've been able to have input on a lot of the issues that have been great controversies in San Diego, from the Mission Valley Stadium to the revitalization of Mission Bay, housing policy issues, the future of the park, the future of Anza Borrego State Park, all sorts of things that are big issues here, and that I was very pleased to be able to have input on.
I love that everywhere you've gone, you've decided to immerse yourself and involve yourself and learn about the landscape and the politics and everything that goes into every place. I think it's just so fascinating and cool to kind of have that immersive level as opposed to just the surface level of being part of a community, because you see it from all sides. So yeah, that's super fascinating.
The thing, though, is that I never ran for office myself. And people would often ask me if I was interested in running for office. I had a brief flirtation with it in Los Angeles at one point, when a member of the city council whose district I lived in passed away suddenly. So there was an open seat. I thought really seriously of running for that, because I was very active in LA at the time and visible, and it could have been a respectable candidate. But even then, when campaigns cost a lot less than they do today, I quickly realized that I simply couldn't raise the money that was necessary to be a legitimate candidate. And so instead, I supported a friend of mine who ran for that office, did not succeed that time, but ran for it again the next time and did get elected. This was a guy named Michael Wu, who subsequently ran for mayor in Los Angeles, but lost. And but watching his experience really ridded me of any interest in running for office, because I could see how his life had turned into a fishbowl where everything he did, everything he said was scrutinized to the nth degree. He had no more privacy and no solitude. Had to be so careful about everything he said and did. So anyway, that cured me of ever wanting to run for office. But I liked working on campaigns, and I worked on them in LA, and I continued working on them here. Most recently, I was the policy director for Barbara Bree's mayoral campaign. And I'd known Barbara all the way back to the 70s, when she was a newspaper reporter and was writing stories about things I was working on. And we just reconnected when I moved to San Diego. And so when she ran for the city council, I worked on that campaign, which was successful. And when she ran for mayor, I worked on that one as well. Had she won, I probably would have gone to work for her in City Hall, but that wasn't the case. So I'm just continuing to write and work on politics from the outside.
Wonderful. I wanted to open up and see if there's any other questions from the audience. Oh, Robert, yeah, go for it.
Not so much as a question, but a comment. When you talk about the immigrant and how, coming to America, and for me and other marginalized groups in this country, we feel like sometimes in our lives, they're like outsiders. They're like, because society just says, oh no, you're different, you're the other. And so sometimes we do feel like an immigrant, a foreigner in our own country.
Mhm.
And it just struck a nerve with me because at certain points in my life, I felt that way. I'm saying, why am I feeling like this? I was born here. But again, politics being what they are, people thinking what they are, homophobia, misogyny, antisemitism being what they are, some of us feel so marginalized that we feel like, are we Americans? Is this our America?
Mhm.
It's like, why does our country do this to us?
Yeah, I know. And one of the op-eds I wrote for the Union Tribune talked about how tribal we are. You know, how even though we say one nation, and talk about ourselves as if we're all one people, we really are capable of breaking up into all sorts of groups when it suits our purposes. And you know, it was realizing that as I was saying before, was a big factor in my writing this book, from taking what started out as a project just for my family and turning it into something that I wanted a wider audience to read. Because I wanted people to see, look, here was someone that came here as a teenager, and look what he has contributed to American society and culture and politics. And it wasn't to pat myself on the back or boast about things I had done. It was with the hope that people would read about it and feel like, that's not an outsider. That's not somebody we should view as being different than us. And yet, at the same time, I want people to all people to cherish the ways in which they're different from one another, because that's what makes us a diverse culture, a diverse society. You know, it'd be kind of boring if we all were completely identical in our backgrounds and views and tastes and everything. So I love the fact that I have the background that I have, but I also love the fact that I'm part of this larger culture that has many things in it that unify us. You know, so try to make the best of both worlds.
Exactly. And I thank you for this. I thank you for the book and for you being here. I appreciate it very much.
Good, thank you. You know, I'm happy to go back and talk a little more about some of the things I addressed earlier, or if there are any other questions, I'm happy to take those. Eileen, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm looking around. I'm noticing not a lot of cameras on this evening, which is okay. I know some people may be finishing up dinner or doing some evening routine stuff. So we can leave the chat and we can leave this room open for a few more moments to see if anyone has any burning questions. Mm-hmm. But while we're waiting for that, what I will remind everyone is that the book is for sale at a number of different online venues. I will drop those in the chat now. So Barnes & Noble and through the publisher, as well as on Amazon. And if there's any other questions, please let us know. Don't be shy, everyone.
Oh, and let me just mention that the Amazon version is available in both print and on Kindle. I know a lot of people are Kindle readers, so that you can get it there in that form as well.
Well, I left that pregnant pause on there long enough. I think this was really just a lovely evening to spend together, and giving us the opportunity to host you and learn more about your history and your family's history. And I know for those of you that are joining us for our Yom HaShoah activities later in the week for Holocaust Remembrance, hearing these stories is always very important, especially this time of year. So please do keep that all in mind this week. And we're really happy that everyone was able to spend some time with us tonight. Thank you all.